Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Bradley Wolfe, and I'm going over Chapter 2, Origins of Public Speaking in the Public Speaking Project textbook. This chapter talks about the origins of public speaking going all the way back to ancient Greece. Now, I will say this chapter is a bit Western-centric. It really talks about kind of ancient Greece, Rome, and going through European history regarding public speaking. And certainly there are a lot of other places where they've used public speaking throughout the world. So I think this chapter is missing a lot of good content that it could have, but I'll make sure to clarify and add to it in places where I can add a bit more. But it's good just to understand this isn't the entire world here. This is just really the European perspective on the origins of public speaking. So the introduction here talks about kind of goes back, art of public speaking goes back to well before the ancient Greece, more than 2,500 years ago. A lot of places around the world throughout history and even today have this oral tradition where their speakers, the people who are talking, are the carriers of knowledge. That's how knowledge was shared. Before the written word, people used to tell stories, right? To tell stories and share ideas through public speaking. So we can look all over the world. Every single culture has some traditions in public speaking that are very valuable. But there's been a lot of changes as well. So here I live in the United States. So here in the United States, we often use a lot of the same strategies and frameworks that were used in ancient Greece. So some of that has stayed the same and carried through throughout time, but others of it has changed significantly. So here it says, what is public speaking? Has it really changed since the ancient Greece and Rome? The concept of public speaking hasn't changed. It's remained the same. However, it's transition. So again, this chapter talks about those transitions. So we're going to start with ancient Greece in section 2.2 about the rise of democracy. So rhetoric, which is a fancy word for public speaking. So rhetoric, as defined by Aristotle, is the faculty of discovering in the particular case all of the available means of persuasion. So it's really broader than public speaking. It's those rhetorical strategies. And Aristotle, as many people know, was one of those people back in ancient Greece who was carrying forward a lot of information, right? A lot of intelligence beyond just, public speaking and rhetoric. I mean, he talked a lot. There was Plato, there was Aristotle. We'll talk about Draco. There were plenty of others during this time period who were teachers, right? There were teachers, there were orators, they were kind of speaking on these topics, and sharing the information that they knew in their frameworks and how they view things. So you can kind of read through this to get some more details about what was going on during this period. But it talks here about the citizens of Athens in 621 BC commissioned Draco, so one of the elders, a very wise Greek person, to organize their system of laws through codification. So again, it was a lot of oral traditions up until this point, but then it got down into writing. One of the reasons we have all this information in ancient Greece today was because these oral traditions and strategies of speaking were written down into books and then carried throughout history. It was those written word. We look at a lot of other places around the world, as I mentioned earlier, that also have oral traditions, but if they weren't written down and carried through, definitely through that Western view of knowledge in this that the textbook shares in this chapter, right? We don't know about their strategies, their perspectives, their ideas. Some of it's lost in time. Some of those oral traditions kind of just go, and some of them are still carried through here and there, and influence each other in many ways. So it's not all gone, right? There's still definitely a knowledge from other cultures that they wrote down, right? Maybe not written down in English, so it's not brought to the United States. If it's written down in Chinese or, in whatever other language. I mean, many other languages there. Things don't always get translated readily and shared between people. So often, again, our perspectives on rhetoric is a bit Western in nature. So there's other ways of giving a good speech beyond what this textbook says. But there are good ideas that have lasted, a couple thousand years. So they do work well and are good at influencing people. And again, as Aristotle said, about those means of persuasion. So they're definitely effective. It talks a little bit about, you can read through this about different, eras of, how things have changed in terms of their laws and structure back in ancient Greece. Again, about being persuasion, how it's used in government, right? They talk a lot about government and structuring, kind of founding some democracy, some form of democracy at that time. So they used a lot of persuasion to influence each other. And that's when they were thinking about public speaking as a means to influence and change the laws of society, the structure. So that's often what they're thinking about. And these original frameworks of, of, of public speaking are based on that. So it talks a little bit about the nature of rhetoric. There was a need for training in public speaking because you train people, then more people could get involved in the democracy. If more people were able to engage in the debates over the laws and participate in the courtrooms, it was allowed people to engage in democracy. So they felt public speaking was a very important skill back then, just the way engaged. Today we may use social media, right? With the advent of the internet and new technologies, we use social media to influence and engage in democratic processes quite frequently. But you certainly can still go down to, the city hall, the school board, go down to the legislature, even Congress in Washington, D.C., and you can get involved using your public speaking skills in order to advocate for what you believe in. You can also do public advocacy. This textbook talks a little bit about that, just going out in public and advocating for what you believe in. But again, it's very important. So not only is it important to be a good speaker, but it's also important to be able to critique speakers and understand those strategies and look through those elements of persuasion and whether they're being used effectively, whether they're being used ethically, right? So that's why it's important to study public speaking as well, and not just as a speaker, but also as a listener, so when bringing in this information. So it's very influential within government, within education. This rhetoric and oratory was very important. So it talks a little bit about dialectics and logic here. So dialectic can be defined as a debate intended to resolve a conflict between two contradictory or polar opposites, or apparently contradicting ideas or elements logically, establishing truths on both sides rather than disproving one argument. So they talk a lot. If you read a bit about Plato, it talks about, Plato's writes about Socrates as well by having this dialectical reasoning, and the debates going back and forth between two sides of an argument. So when we think about public speaking, and if you were to ever to participate in, speech and debate competitions, they often talk about being able to take both sides of the issue and engaging with it, being able to understand the whole picture a little bit better. So then there's philosophical relativism in here. So the absolute truth in this theory of philosophical relativism means the truth is unknowable. Perhaps it doesn't exist. Everything's relative, right? It's relative to your perspective. It's relative to what you're talking about. So again, those dialectics, those two opposites, there's some truth in both sides, but there's some relative nature to it. So again, that's some of the ideas that are being played around with here. And then it talks a little bit about the rhetorical approach. Aristotle cited 4 different uses of rhetoric. So it's about truth and justice to maintain natural superiority. It's suited well for popular audiences. It also teaches us both sides of the issues and to refute unfair arguments. And it's a means of self-defense. You can defend yourself with your words. So even in interpersonal conversation, being able to use rhetorical skills and strategies are going to help you just be a speaker and engage with other people. Whether it's a debate, whether you're arguing with someone, or even just trying to get your point across. If you're informing them about your perspective, being able to speak clearly is helpful there. So again, you can read through this if you want more depth there, but that's a bit about ancient Greece and some of the ideas that are being played around during that time. Then we move on to the Roman Republic. So again, slightly different. I often, in my mind, lump the two together. All right, definitely there are differences, but there's also many similarities and overlap between these two, time periods in history and regions, right, geographic regions. So it talks a little bit about Cicero. Cicero is known as a very famous orator, being able to speak, have those good public speaking skills. It talks a little bit about kind of teaching rhetoric and teaching, having rules, right? Rules for how to be a good public speaker. So look at textbooks like this textbook gives, rules, suggestions. I'd say they're suggestions, they're ideas that you can choose from, but they're rules. If you followed back then, it's like if you follow these rules, you'll be a good public speaker. These are the rules you need to follow in order to achieve excellence. So that's what he wrote about and what he spoke about. at that time. So there's a lot of, again, using Greek theories and practices, but kind of writing them down there to be have some perfection. Then there's also Quintilian's influence here, another orator. So again, some of the names here you may recognize or you may want to learn more about them in terms of famous people in public speaking history, but also history, kind of the Western history in general, at least. Definitely have some fame to them. So again, it's talking about how education has been spreading during this time and how public speaking is a very important part of education. We'll jump ahead here in a moment, but again, uh, you know, how rhetoric and persuasion and public speaking was used in our educational system, especially in the United States here. It kind of came back. It was more of a revival of public speaking later, using some of these very old and tested strategies. So it talks also about rhetoric as a moral force in the community. Many religions, they have some sort of preacher, kind of sharing those ideas. They're respected, because of their, status as an elder or reverend or, whatever sort of religious qualifications they have, depending on the religion. They're using rhetoric to share their knowledge, right? Their interpretation of holy text and share it through the oral form to get people to motivated and moved, through that spirit. So there's definitely a moral force to rhetoric as well and to public speaking. So Plato defined rhetoric as a philosophy rather than an art, and art is more seen as an unnecessary tool. It's a tool you can use, but it talks about kind of the philosophical aspects. And they also talk about truth. So it talks here, it's comparing Plato and Quintilian a bit here, also Aristotle, bringing in these different people. So the main ideas here is talking about, that there's not just one way to look at it, right? There are a lot of different ways that public speaking, rhetoric, oratory, these ideas, I'm using them kind of synonymous here. There's definitely some differences between them, but, they were framed differently, right? People frame them differently and use them differently. And today we have a variety of perspectives that we can use and implement related to public speaking. We move on to the Middle Ages, and they have St. Augustine. So again, using Christianity and the spread of Christianity in Europe. Rhetoric was a way to express ideas and express beliefs. But the thing is that the ancient Greek and Romans were pagans, right? They weren't Christians. They were before Christ. So they didn't feel that it was they didn't want to use it directly, right? They wanted to create their own interpretation of it. And we see this a lot in Christianity in Europe, how they were taking other ideas of paganism and things that already existed, that people already believed and held on to, and kind of converting them into this Christian religion. So there's a lot of a variety of influences to bring Christianity together. But it also talks about here that he was a teacher of rhetoric. St. Augustine was a teacher of rhetoric before converting to Christianity. Right when Christianity existed, there were tons of Christians, so people had to convert their ideas and their perspectives and saw how they aligned with Christianity. So it talks about again how it's still influenced in education in the Middle Ages. Reading, writing, and arithmetic are logic and grammar. These are things that are somewhat taught. You write out your speeches, you kind of read, and it's influenced. It was for a long time communication and English were together, right? They were kind of one category, and they got separated in the American education system into two different fields of study, one most on the written word and one more on the spoken word. So it talks a little bit more about Christianity and how it kind of moved through those influences during this time. It's listing off a ton of thinkers and speakers that all contributed to knowledge. And again, they were a lot of the times that people would come together in spaces and share ideas with each other, right? They would verbally share these ideas, especially before the printing press, right? The printing press, the written word got so widespread, it was very influential. But before that, they had to copy down by hand, anything they wanted to write. So oral communication, that public speaking, was the way wisdom and ideas were shared. Then it talks about the Renaissance here. So the end of the Middle Ages was witnessed by the birth of the Renaissance. It talked about humanism and a bunch of other thinkers. You can read through them here. It was definitely an intellectual and cultural movement. Talks about the humanists here. So again, they wanted to go back to that ancient Greece, ancient Greek, ancient Rome, those ideas. They wanted to bring them back. So they started studying Greek and Latin classical works, and they opened up a lot of these libraries. So these scholars were sharing their ideas with people during this time. They wanted to kind of give new life to them. So the Middle Ages, it was very focused on Christianity and just the Christian perspective. And here, hey, what are all these other ideas that we've come up with throughout European history? And because it was written down, right, they were able to go back and read these ancient Greek and ancient Roman, people, right, read about their ideas. If it was just oral tradition, it still had influence, like through the church and everything else, but they wouldn't have those direct sources. So we see throughout history that public speaking has been very influential, but it will change, right? It will change throughout history. It will change when one person shares it to another. It's going to be a little bit different. And then how it comes forward today until the point where it's written down, right? Who all was before that? We don't always know, right? We don't always are able to keep track and get it back because there aren't recordings of it. And in the United States and this culture that we have around us, we like that written word. We like citing our sources, right? This is school. Cite your sources, right? We want to know where it came from. But prior to that, it was like, hey, this is our collective knowledge, and I'm just sharing my ideas, and we'll see what keeps moving forward and what gets lost to time. And there's a lot of ideas. There are a lot of stories, theories that again, we don't know what happened to them throughout history. So again, they're reading through these Greek and Roman texts. They're bringing them back. Here it talks about being rationalist. It talks about Peter Ramus and Rene Descartes. They want objective scientific truth, so they want to follow that logic and reasoning. We look at ethos, pathos, and logos in public speaking. So ethos is the character, the ethical character of the person. Pathos is more that emotion, the passion that they put into it, and then logos is that logic. So right, we want to make sure it's logic. We want to make sure it makes sense. The arguments are in place. Certainly, you can take multiple classes just on logic or just on reasoning and how those arguments are in terms of public speaking. We'll talk a little bit about that in this textbook. One of the chapters focuses on that, but overall, it's again, there's a lot more to it that we can go into. So again, it's talking about a lot of famous people throughout history, and as I'm sure you've noticed, these are all famous white men from European history. So there's a lot missing here on the influences that were had. But again, we're still using these works. It still influences people today. And the other ones, which are still valuable, right, other valuable perspectives from around the world, they're just not being used as much in the United States yet. So maybe there'll be a resurgence and things will change, and this textbook will be rewritten to be more inclusive of all the different perspectives, because certainly there's a lot of different perspectives in terms of oral communication, public speaking, that would be valuable to understand. So now we're getting into epistemology. The epistemology is the study of the origin, nature, methods, and limits of human knowledge. So again, epistemologically, right, this is from a European perspective, because that's what we're looking at. The origins of this knowledge is back to ancient Greece and ancient Rome, and we're tracking those theories and ideas to the modern day. So if we use different methods and relied less on the written word and more on oral communication, it may seem different if we used a different epistemology. So again, this is talks a little bit about the epistemological tradition here. So certainly you can read through that if you want. Then there's this bell letters movement. There means finer, beautiful letters. Again, I don't speak French, so they would pronounce it differently. I'm just going to call it bell letters, right? So this is looking about that aesthetic quality. So not just is it logical, is it rational, but is it beautiful? Are you giving a beautiful speech? Is it a beautiful speech about nothing and illogical? Well, it's still a very good speech. And today we look at a lot of public speakers, politicians. They may be very good speakers, but what they saying true? Or we could have people who are very logical, very reasonable, right? They know what they're talking about, but they are so boring to listen to, right? It's not well presented, and we don't follow along with it. So a lot of times people are going to go with the, people who are good speakers, right, and eloquent. That's who they're going to listen to, even if it's illogical or if it doesn't make sense, right? If it creates movement or has an impact, there could be truth to that. But this really talks about, again, it being beautiful and ideas of perfection in modern American, ideas. We want some sort of flaws in it because it makes them more human and more relatable. So that's also kind of what is perfection, or what is, influential speech. Because there's some politicians who aren't seen as great speakers, but they're very influential, just because of their flaws in their speech makes them kind of human, down to earth, grounded, and we appreciate that. So it's interesting what is seen as effective and what is, again, influential. Over time, it changes, right? So these different movements track different things which are emphasized. So this is another trend, the elocutionary movement. Uh, again, it's more towards that, having good pronunciation, good delivery, and following different strategies that are going to have you good delivery. There's a quote here from Pete Hamill. He steps on stage and draws his sword of rhetoric. And when he is through, someone is lying wounded, and thousands others are either angry or consoled. So again, it's kind of that performative nature of rhetoric. Sometimes, this communication, public speaking is affiliated with theater as well. So this is more of that. I don't even want to say it's fully theatrical elements, but it is about having, again, kind of, that presentation, the voice, the gesture, the nonverbal and verbal elements of it. And so getting very, very picky. If you ever participate in speech and debate, people will go down to how am I going to say this word, right? Not just what words am I going to say, what are my arguments, what are my logic, but how am I going to say them? How is it going to be delivered? What nonverbal elements am I going to have that are going to impact it? We look at politicians, again, are you speaking like this, or your thumbs are up? Again, it's non-verbally sending a positive message into people's minds, so they're more likely to agree with you. That's what research said at one time. Again, things can change, a culture can change, but it's something to keep in mind. So if we go to the conclusion, this is a brief history of rhetoric. This chapter is, again, very Western perspective, tracking ancient ideas from ancient Greece and ancient Rome through the modern day kind of Western front, going through the Western front, coming to the United States, and where we bring a lot of the ideas from. So this textbook does talk a lot about ideas from ancient Greece and ancient Rome, and the people who again, they were thinking about rhetoric, they were thinking about oratory and persuasion during the time, and how other people have added to that and changed things and focused in different ways. And how you want to focus with your public speaking skills. Again, there are a lot of ideas out there, and there's certainly a lot that are left out of this book as well. So it's good to take into account other ideas. But these are all things, again, time tested, and so that's what I would say. Why we're studying this is because it's time tested. There are a lot of good ideas here, and it's important to know where they come from. So it's important to know, kind of just appreciate the people who've contributed to these ideas over time, and it's also good to recognize the limits of this knowledge, and how it's not necessarily representative of everyone. Now, some of the other chapters in this textbook, thankfully, do have a little bit more diverse contributing factors in how we look at public speaking. So there's one chapter just on kind of global perspective, or speaking to a global audience. So there's some appreciation for diversity throughout this book, but this is one of the more limited chapters, and understanding that some of the foundations of rhetoric. Again, appreciating where it's come from, but also understanding the limits of it. So I appreciate you listening into this about chapter 2 in the public speaking project, and I hope you watch the other videos to get ideas of the rest of the textbook. So good luck with your studies, and take care.